Each Halo had a role to fill. Halo Combat Evolved was responsible for laying down the groundwork for the series to follow. It set up the different factions and how they act, along with establishing the basics of combat. Halo 2 showed where things can be expanded with increasing enemy and weapon variety, all while setting a new standard for level design. Halo 3 is focused on polish over everything else. So much was introduced in the first two that all that was left was to refine what those games did so well and craft what many consider the best Halo and one of the best FPS ever created. But is it? Let's get into it. This is part 3 of my Halo series. With a greater focus on polish, Halo 3 doesn't introduce many new mechanics, and the ones they do don't alter the way you'll be playing all that much. The main addition comes in the form of single-use abilities. These come in a few variations from bubble shields to turrets to trip mines and much more. I think nearly all the abilities are useful in some way except for the flare, which never fails to blind me, and only me. But in general, these abilities don't change or add much to gameplay. That's not to say they aren't useful, they are. They just don't bring enough to gameplay to alter how you will play the same way that something like invisibility did in Halo 2. Being single use, they only affect the current battle, but after they are gone, it's back to the same core mechanics of combat that were present before. And some smaller changes are present in those mechanics, like adding in some new grenades but also limiting the amount you can carry to 2 instead of 4. Along with the ability to remove turns and unleash your inner Terminator. They made sure to keep what worked in previous games while not just making the same game as before. It's not like they're 2K or EA. Health feels a bit higher in 3, which allows for a more aggressive approach. The shooting feels smooth, the jumps are the highest they've ever been, and the only problem I have with the base gameplay is one most people have, and that is you still move a bit slow. Other than that, this is likely the best feel in Halo game. It's the small changes which makes Halo 3 great. Such is the case with level design. Halo 2 had amazing levels that flow between encounters on different scales with a lot of variety. So what does Halo 3 do? It takes what made the levels in Halo 2 great and builds new levels off of it, but doesn't include the low points, such as the slow elevator rides and the boss fights that absolutely did not deserve that title. And it adds real fights against scarabs that show how fucking sick these machines are. Instead of being a simple hop on and kill all the enemies, they redesigned the scarab to have a power core you have to destroy, and any way you do this is perfectly fine. Disabling the legs will force it to land, giving you an opening to hop on board, but if you want to stay off the ship, then you can just blast the ass and destroy the power core from the safety of your own tank. The scarab fights end up being much more enjoyable than the previous incarnation, and are repeated a few times, allowing you to experience these fights in a few different scenarios. They accomplish this through changing the vehicles and environment, which alters the way you'll deal with these battles. The first battle happens in a small area and you'll likely be on a mongoose. This vehicle is fairly weak with no guns on it, and the way you'll likely damage it is through a friendly riding on your back. That sounds weird, but you know what I mean. Contrast this with the final encounter featuring the scarabs, where there are 2 of the bitches.
I count 2 scarabs. Repeat, 2 scarabs.
But with a much larger arena where you can go inside of a tank or in a Hornet. Both of those encounters feel wildly different from each other and end up being enjoyable for separate reasons. The first one feels like a struggle, while the last is a power trip. This same kind of thought process of what can we improve extends to the enemies as well. Because of story reasons, the brutes become the commanders and fully take over the role of the elites, while the other enemies in the Covenant army remain the same. Except, remember the biggest issue in Halo 2? If you don't, I'll give you a second to guess. Did you guess Jackal Snipers? Because it's Jackal Snipers. Those pesky little fucks aren't as common in Halo 3, except for the first mission, which has approximately 89 of the cunts. And then they don't really show up that much afterwards. What the fuck? Why did you do this? It feels like a joke made at my expense, aka the worst type of joke. And then there's the grunts who gained a new trick. Whenever they feel like it, they will just go full on suicide bomber and sprint towards you with no self-preservation at all. Which is fucking gangster as shit. You look at them and think, you're gonna die. And then the grunts will come back with the, nah bitch, we gonna die. And it's one of those things I just find oddly funny. Outside of those changes, much hasn't been introduced or modified on the Covenant ends. Brutes are still aggressive, and Yamnier still fly around. What's new? A few personality additions actually. The grunts blowing themselves up makes sense given what we know of them. They are loyal and courageous but have a tendency to freak out when leadership is killed. Instead of cowering, some grunts take the initiative and go out in a blaze of glory. Then there's the brutes. They got some new weapons and rides that fit them perfectly, like the choppers. Who the fuck else could you see riding in one of these besides a brute? It's a giant motorcycle filled by pure fuck you that rams harder than any other vehicle. There's also the gravity hammer. Yeah, finally there are the jetpack brutes, which look absolutely hilarious. They lack the finesse and smoothness of the elites and just fart around with the jetpacks. Instead of using them for controlled flight, they instead opt for super jumps, and I really like this. It fits so well with their established personality and shows how different the brutes and elites view combat done solely through gameplay. Elites are tacticians that use cunning and everything in their disposal, while the brutes try to overwhelm their foes with their strength. The hunters solidify themselves as tanks with how they will cover grenades with their bodies, shielding everyone else from it. It's things like this that show why the Covenant are one of the better enemy factions in all of games. And then there's the Flood. There isn't a lot you could do with them as they are a parasite, and what they are known for is mindless aggression and sucking ass. All they could do is add some new variations to them, which is exactly what they did. They added a new Flood form that's actually 2, or is it 3? Does this one count as its own separate state? The first form is a long-range attacker that crawls on walls, kinda like a centipede that shoots out green needles. This same thing can transform into a BC form that is essentially the tank version of an infected without the ability to wield weapons. And the third just seems like some weird in-between stage. But that's it, really. Honestly, I wouldn't have minded if they took this opportunity to do with the Flood what they did with the Covenant in Halo 2. Expand upon them instead of adding one enemy that turns into 3, add more variations. Hell, I would have been psyched to see infected grunts or jackals. But as it stands, the Flood doesn't change all that much and the levels with them are very similar as they were before. The best way to deal with them is still the same way as it was in Combat Evolved. Run past them at tremendously slow speeds and hope they don't catch you. The Flood haven't grown in a meaningful way. The only thing that has changed is how many weapons are effective against them. And the only new one that is highly effective is the gravity hammer. The brute shotguns work alright, but not as well. In general, there are a few new additions to your armory that aren't bad but not great, and a return to nearly every weapon from the previous games. The best new weapon outside of the gravity hammer is the laser rifle because of how effective it is against vehicles. But I think if it wasn't obvious already, there isn't much added in the sequel in terms of enemies and weapons. Honestly, this might have been for the best as Halo 3 has the least amount of glaring weaknesses of all the games we've seen thus far. Halo Combat Evolved has repetitive levels with many just being earlier ones in reverse, and so many corridors. The sequel was a lot better but it still had its odd moments with slow sections that forced fights against the Flood, which slowed the pace to a crawl. Halo 3 has some smaller ones such as a lack of encounters that featured flying vehicles, as the Hornet is quite enjoyable to use and there isn't a single mission that focused on the Banshees. I also believe more levels could have used encounters where you fight the Flood and the Covenant at the same time, since most levels feature only one of them heavily while ignoring the other. And it sucks that the Covenant no longer has elites. I love them as an ally, and it makes perfect sense for them to be one. But on the other hand, I really loved Halo 2, which allowed for fights against the brutes and the elites. I think they provide opposing methods of dealing with them that I found fascinating. And speaking of Halo 2, I loved playing as the Arbiter. I think they could have had him as a playable character since his journey could have been quite interesting. But the biggest problem is the final 2 levels are my least favorite, which are Gauntlets of Flood that I'm honestly sick of seeing. The best way to play these levels is the same way that I played the library. It's the same way I played Quarantine Zone. It's the same way I played every Flood level so far. If they aren't going to evolve in a meaningful way that makes them fun, they shouldn't be here. And that's not all that's wrong with them. Cortana, the level, not the sexy blue chick, has a ton of these interruptions from Cortana and the Gravemind that just breaks the flow and acts as weird invisible walls for enemies. By the end of it, I can't even pay attention to what the Gravemind is saying, it just sounds like angry mumbling.
Time has taught me patience, but basking in new freedom, I will know all that I possess!
That's how stupid it fucking sounds to me now. I will say though, the final Warthog section, really fucking good. I think it's better than the first game as it has more visual flair, the area you are traversing is larger and overall feels smoother. But before that is just boring. I can't even think of a joke to describe it. I'm glad the Flood are gone and haven't been in the Halo game since. But if not for those problems, Halo 3 would be close to flawless. So many of the levels are great, like Crow's Nest, which shows how good Bungie were at mixing up combat encounter types. Even though it's all on foot combat, the level goes from one banger of a fight to the next. Battles in the hangar, barracks, and on top of the helipad contrast with each other as the different layouts provide alternate cover options and line of sight. The hangar puts you in a sort of defensive wait scenario as enemies get dropped off on phantoms. This setup promotes defensiveness, which opposes the way the barracks works. This section is more cramped and places you on the offensive. There are more opportunities for flanking enemies in this area and cover is plentiful. And the last section I'll speak about is on the helipad. A shitload of jetpack brutes will come in which limits cover as you can't hide from enemies on top of you, which forces mobility. Overall, just a really solid level and a game full of them. When Halo 3 adds in vehicles, they go all in. You can see this in levels like the Ark and the Covenant. The latter is possibly my favorite level of the series. These missions show how good the Halo series is at giving you feelings of empowerment in the form of tanks, which helps provide some catharsis after a long struggle-filled battle. Such an easily replayable game that is still amazing in my eyes more than a decade later. Most of my videos focus on the changes made between each sequel, but there's a lot that can be said of a game distilling what made the previous ones great, and placing all of its focus on perfecting that formula. So, that's the original trilogy. All three games I enjoyed immensely. Halo 3 is the most consistent and polished of the original three, and I can absolutely see why so many people place it as their favorite one. The levels are some of the best designed, and some of the problems of the predecessors have been smoothed over. Honestly, I think you can make a case for any Halo being a favorite. I'll leave my pick up to all of you to guess, but I would love to hear your favorite game of the original trilogy, and why. Thank you for watching, and hopefully you enjoyed hearing me speak about these games. I'm going to take a break from Halo games for a bit, but I plan to cover at least Halo 4 and 5 before Infinite comes out. Please do the whole like, share, and subscribe thing. As a small channel, I really do appreciate seeing so many people that I've never met leaving me kind and thoughtful comments. It truly does mean a lot, so thank you all so much. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next vid.
Wake me when you need me.